I never felt like I belonged anywhere. I definitely didn't feel like I belonged in my family. Part of the devastation that it was truths that my body already felt about itself. There for other people's pleasure and that it was worthless, that my body's not really mine. Very deep-seated beliefs that were already there patterned my brain and my self-image and outlook on the world and myself and my place in it. I was so angry. All bets were off for me that I just became so filled with just self-hatred and self-loathing. And the main way that that was coming out was just rage. I needed somewhere where it was okay to be really f***ing angry. Like, I didn't have to do anything. I needed a place where I could go, where I could just be the disaster that I was, and that it was seen as an asset. I could walk into a room and people would be offended and or afraid just by my very physical presence. And so for a young woman who felt totally powerless, I didn't even have control over my own body. Like, that felt a lot like power. Because I was so disconnected from the things that I was saying and doing as being actually and genuinely hurtful and harmful to other human beings.
Mine is the only voice.
What
Wow.
have I been doing?
Lay down my autonomy.
After that, it got very dark very quickly.
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening on those podcast platforms and you'd like to see our faces and join in on the conversation, we love when you guys do that. Head over to YouTube at Cults to Consciousness. You can leave those words of encouragement for our guests. It means so much to them. They are real people. They read the comments. It just really makes them feel seen, validated, loved, and supported. And of course, it boosts the algorithm so more people can become aware of these things and become more compassionate and empathetic, as we truly hope the point of this channel is for. So today's guest, we were referred to her by our previous guest, Christian Picciolini, and we're so excited because during our interview with him, I kept asking what would make a female, a girl, a woman want to join this neo-Nazi movement. It felt very male-dominated, a lot of kind of testosterone going on, and he was talking about how he had a girlfriend who was involved. That's not our guest today, but the question came up, what would make someone want to join as a woman? And so I was like, please, do you have anybody? And he sent me over to today's guest. So thank you so much for joining me, Shannon Foley Martinez.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, good. Yeah, I am too. And there's a lot I don't know about your story. So I'm excited to kind of learn everything in the moment here. So let's talk about your childhood, your early life, the things that may have made you more vulnerable or more susceptible to wanting to join the neo-Nazi group.
Sure. And I think as I have done this work and shared this part of my story over many, many years, for me, it's a lot of times people are like, well, I've had those things happen too. And I didn't end up becoming a, hateful person. I didn't end up being a racist. I didn't end up being a neo-Nazi or whatever, and I think it's really important to legitimize that. For me, it was a very set of unique circumstances that all coalesced into the environment where this was something that could happen. But at the same time, people who have childhoods like mine or filled with even more layers of trauma than my own, that it might not come out looking like the overt that I latched onto as a teenager and young adult, but it might come out as other kinds of violence and other kinds of self-harm and, substance abuse disorders or self-harm or, all of the myriad ways that unprocessed trauma festers into. So for me, I don't seek forgiveness. People's forgiveness is irrelevant to me. For me, it's accountability, uh, genuine remorse, and a life of genuine amends making. If people decide to forgive the things that I've done, then I am grateful for that. But it is not why I do what I do.
Yeah.
I'm 50 years old, and I know that I will regret that afternoon espresso later tonight when I'm laying in bed with one eye open. Um, but I'm 50 years old, and I think I grew up very typical to most middle class white people of my generation. I grew up in a family where, my parents were still together. When my dad passed away last year, my parents had been married for over 50 years. I have an older brother who's 2.5 years older than me, and he ended up being valedictorian of his high school class, and went to School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and all these other external markers of being a success that I never met, that I've never met. But he has also struggled with substance abuse disorder for most of his life, and continues. He's been sober for a couple years now, but has really struggled to maintain sobriety and stuff like that. And so it's for a lot of people, it's, the external signifiers of our lives might make us look successful or whatever, but on the inside, we're still really grappling with the hurts and wounds and traumas of our childhoods and stuff.
Yeah.
I was involved in all kinds of stuff. I was a championship athlete in multiple sports. The only sport I didn't really play was basketball. I'm 5'2" and still as an adult, as I've I have the smallest hands ever. I have little baby hands or whatever. But basically if it was a sport, I probably played it and I was probably pretty good at it. I was in gifted classes. My parents were actually involved in, a lot of the activities and stuff that I was a part of, but it was in ways where it really amplified sort of stressfulness of it or whatever. It's like I was a pitcher, and my dad would umpire games that I pitched or whatever. It was like I was this competitive diver, and he would be one of the judges or whatever. And so it's like I was great, I'm grateful, and I am, that I had the opportunities that I had and that they were involved and they were there. But it was in this way where it was a really high stakes, it's childhood sports, but it became really high stakes all of the time or whatever, and reflecting back at this point in my life, at my childhood, that so much of my life felt like it was really high stakes all of the time. It's really high pressure all of the time. I came wired as someone who really needs to understand why things are the way that they are. I need the rules of, some wherever I'm at to make sense to me before I can give my assent to them. I mean, I'm autistic, so I like very clear directions. I like under consistent rules. I like understanding rules that, I want them. If they don't make sense, I'm just wired to just not, I'm not going to just be like, okay, that's cool, I'll do that. I'm going to question that. There are times when I wish that maybe I was not wired that way, that I could chill out a little bit, but I can't. And in my household, the rules were changing all of the time. Something that might be okay, and my brother and I running and jumping down the stairs might be okay at 11 o'clock during the day, but suddenly at 7 p.m. when the adults were tired, it became a punishable offense. You know what I mean? And that's just a tiny small thing or whatever, but it was that was how everything was all of the time, that the rules were changing all of the time. It was totally dependent on the adults' frame of mind and well-being. Compliance was expected, and for me, I'm just kind of well, I can do that if you tell me why, even if it's I'm tired and I don't want to parent anymore. But I'm well, why do I have to go to bed now? I'm not tired. Why do I have to do that? right? And which so many kids ask, right? Like that's like very normal question for a child to ask, But in my case, I didn't know how that would necessarily be met. It might be met with me getting hit, and it might be met with me getting sent to bed with no dinner, or whatever. Like, or it might just be like, oh, yeah, whatever. And the rule might not be enforced that time. So it was very chaotic. Playing family game night or whatever. It's like it would be fun until my brother and I were like laughing too hard because it's family game night, whatever. And then suddenly like a switch would flip and like it would just now we would be in trouble because we were being too loud or it was just so unpredictable. Every time my brother and I were hurt or we were sick, that the default response was for us to be in trouble. And it'd be like, you would come in and just be like, you would just like have a, bloody lip or whatever. And be like, oh, yeah. And it'd be like, how many times have I told you not to play tackle football? Like, what are you doing? Or whatever. I broke my foot one Christmas time I put on like a fancy dress up dress and we had those like plastic, those fake plastic Christmas candles that people would have in their windows. I had the Nutcracker on the stereo and I was doing gymnastics, so, dancing and I did like a cartwheel and I came down and I just like hurt I had like a little tiny fracture in my foot, but it was so, it was so hurt. And I was in so much trouble. And it was like, I told you how much it's gonna cost us. It's Christmas time, and like you ruined Christmas or whatever,
Oh,
things like that. And eventually it'd be like, oh, okay, well you're okay, and but the very first response was always this. Whenever the adults felt powerless, they sought to find a sense of power through yelling, through, that in all the ways that so much of everything that happens to us in, high demand situations or whatever is like people essentially powerless feeling people who are seeking ways to feel powerful,
yeah.
right? Through the control and coercion of other people, and so like that was very much, my parents. But as I said, I was involved in all these activities and I was involved in all of these sports and everything. And so I still had places in my early childhood where I had adults who were predictable. I had adults who were safe people. I had, one of the things about athletics for me that was really good was that the rules are the same all the time, right? Well, I'm an Eagles fan, so like maybe they're not the same all the time. but that it was like the rules are the same all the time when you're talking about childhood sports or whatever for the most part. It's like everyone has the same set of rules that they go by. Looking back, I had several coaches as a child that my relationships with them like I wouldn't be allowed to have those relationships today. There was nothing untowards about them, but I was really close to especially like some of my male coaches, and we would like go to diving shows together and like I don't know, stuff like that. And like there's not like I would not be allowed to be unsupervised with a male coach like today. But for me, it probably was something that was enough to help me still be alive today. That those relationships that I had were probably, that they were actually probably really, really important to me to just, to have some sort of stable relationships with adults in my life. And I grew up in a neighborhood where it was like, yeah, I joke that like I grew up on the set of Stranger Things, but without the demigorgons and stuff. That it's like you could if you rode your bike around, you could always like find somewhere to go, someone to play with if you knocked on enough doors or whatever. And so it was like you could go to your friends' houses and like, it's like their parents might also be crazy, but as not their child, you could go to their house and it was like, okay, like here's an adult that isn't gonna suddenly haul off and like hit me or whatever, or like have this whole I don't know. I was always late. Like now I'm like, yeah, I'm neurodivergent. Like I'm time blind, like I'm not trying to be 15 minutes late every time I leave the house. I just I'm not intentionally like doing this as like to be a bad person. But my parent, is like much to their vexation. I was always late coming home. Always. They gave me a little stopwatch and all this other stuff. Like, and the solution that they landed on was that they were going to hit me they were going to spank me with this metal-edged ruler
Oh.
one time for every minute that I was late, right? But the lesson that I learned was just like, oh, well, if I can just take the pain of whatever, I can just do whatever I want. I'll be like,
Oh.
I'll just come home. You gonna hit me 60 times? I don't care. Like, whatever, like as a little girl, that's a pretty but at that point, I sort of became ungovernable because I was just kind of like, if I can take the pain, I don't have to listen to you at all. I can do whatever I want to do if I'm just willing to take enough physical pain.
Oh, wow.
So at 11, my dad came home and let us know that we were going to move from where I had grown up, just outside of Philadelphia. We were going to move from there to rural southern Michigan, just north of Toledo, Ohio, that he had transferred for work and that we were going to move. And I was devastated. I was so despondent about this. I really didn't want to go, but I'm 11. I don't really have a choice or a say in the matter. I didn't know then, but I have since learned that 11 years old is a particularly rough time for there to be huge transitions in a child's life. Have you ever seen the movie Inside Out?
Yeah.
Well, the main character in that is 11. And they chose that age on purpose because that is a particularly vulnerable and important age for emotional development. And unlike in the movie, we got to rural southern Michigan and I did not suddenly turn around and have all this love and support from my parents. In fact, everything got actually kind of worse. We now lived in a neighborhood where there were no kids. I could still ride my bike, but I had to ride it, a few miles to the neighborhoods where kids lived. They had all been friends their whole lives, right? And so it was one of the cornerstones of truly of my entire life, but definitely of my young childhood was just that I felt like I never felt like I belonged anywhere. I definitely didn't feel like I belonged in my family. A lot of the sports that I played, were actually individual sports, swimming, diving, gymnastics, things like that. And I just, I always felt like an outsider everywhere. And I still, there are times that I still today, I have 7 kids.
Oh my God.
I have 7 kids and a grandbaby and all that stuff. And there are times where I still feel like I don't belong anywhere. And I'm like, I don't go anywhere. There's nowhere that I belong. There's nowhere that is really my place. But when we moved, it was trying, because it's one of the things that we do as human beings is we need places where we belong, where we feel like we belong for the totality of our authentic selves. And these kids, they had all known each other their whole lives. And so I really was an outsider. And when I got there, I didn't have the same hair as everyone. I didn't listen to the same music. I didn't dress the same. And in fact, that they were like, "Are you from England?"
Are you
And I
from
was like,
England?
yeah, I was like, "No, you guys, I just asked for a glass of water." My Philly accent was so strong. They thought I was from another country or whatever. I'm like, "I'm just from Philly, yo."
That happened to me too. When I moved from Utah to Oregon, people are like, "Why do you talk weird?" I'm like, "No, I don't." So funny.
And it's I don't know. Yeah. And so as a kid, it was just okay, well, this is such a weird experience.
Hey guys, we're going to get back to our video here in just a second, but first I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about the sponsor for today's video, Incogni. Recently, we realized just how unprotected we are when it comes to online security, especially with putting ourselves out there with this channel. When we signed up for Incogni, we learned about all of the unethical practices going on with data brokers and people search sites who are selling our personal information without our knowledge. Since signing up for Incogni, they have removed my personal data from over 457 companies. It also shows a comprehensive comprehensive list of requests sent, which is over 500, in progress, and completed. The best part is they continue to monitor all of these things, so I don't have to do anything and my data will continuously be removed. In fact, it actually shows I've saved 342 hours if I were to manually send these requests myself. Information they are removing include emails, phone numbers, addresses, financial information, and so much more. You can cancel anytime, and they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. And just for watching today's video, they are offering our supporters 60% off their annual plan. So if you're anything like us, you value your online security, you don't want to fall victim to identity theft, you value your privacy, now is the perfect time to try it out. You can go to incognito.com/Shalise, and the code Shalise should auto-populate for you. And just to make things easier, we've put the link in the description so you can check it out. Thanks again for being here and supporting us. We really appreciate you. Now back to our interview.
This sounds so trite. This sounds so trite saying it, but it was such a huge deal to me that before we moved, I was in 6th grade, and that was in middle school. And I just was like, I had always thought teenagers were so cool, and I couldn't wait to just do teenage stuff. And I was in middle school, and I got to switch classes, and and I just was like, I just thought I was just hot stuff. And then when we moved, they were on a junior high system. So 6th grade was back in elementary school.
No.
And I was like, I have to go to baby school again. It was such a devastating blow. And all at the same time, all right, this is very random, but all at the same time, I think it was either right after we moved or we had gone to go visit the school, or it's one of those. It was, I think it might have been right after the Challenger blew up. So somewhere in this circle of all of this transition, that the space shuttle Challenger blew up while I was in this now elementary school in 6th grade too, which probably did have some personal impact on me. But it was, just that whole, I think part of it is just, in a larger sense where it's just king killers or whatever, where it's oh, here's NASA and all this stuff. And just no, I just watch these people blow up on TV. Everyone around me just watch these people die on national TV while we're at school, and then have to go take a spelling test or whatever.
Yeah.
It was really, I don't know. It's only very recently that I was that all happened right around that time too, or whatever. Where it's just, I think part of that is just that there's nothing that you can even, things that you thought okay, these are stable things that I can count on. That is just kind of okay, well, actually, no, not even that. You can't even count on that.
Mhm.
That's a no-go. And for me, I actually really wanted to be an astronomer when I was a kid. I wanted to be an astronomer, and then I wanted to be a volcanologist and studying volcanoes. And then I wanted to be an astrovolcanologist, where I studied volcanoes in space. I don't do any of those things, but last night I made everybody look at the moon. I was like, you gotta come outside, it's full moon, look. Oh, look at the moon person. It doesn't even matter. Every night, I'm look at the moon. It's so beautiful. That's in there somewhere with all this. So the basic sort of culmination of all this is we land in rural southern Michigan. Everything that is a struggle in my life becomes a greater struggle. And now I'm entering into adolescence. And so, everything that goes along with that is amplifying all of the things that I'm struggling with in my life. I did still play sports though at this point. I really think that was something that kept me okay for as long as it did. I still had some coaches that I was really close to, and and now even as a 50-year-old, that is just, for me, it's a lot of import for me being very in my body, right? And that just the physicality of sports, I think, is something that was incredibly beneficial for me and continues to be for me. Now it looks, like lifting heavy weights and hiking and kayaking and, and doing stuff like that, rather than organized sports or whatever, riding my bike, whatever. as being really in my body because I can get very, I get very trapped kind of in my brain. When it came time for me to go to high school, I had the choice to go to the public high school where I was going in Michigan or to go to a private high school across the border in Toledo that had like better academics and stuff like that. And, it's like I'm 13. Like I want to, it's like I'm not, I want to be doing a good job. I want a life that, that my parents want for me, right? To go to college and be successful and do, like do all those things. I was so perpetually bored at school from very early on. Like this was part of like, like I was as like a first grader. I was just like, well, why do I have to do homework? Like if I can already get A's on your test, like why do I have to do homework? And I never got a good answer, so I like basically just never did homework. I was just like, until you give me a good answer for why I gotta do your homework, I'm just not doing it. But I was very intellectually curious, like I was reading science news and all this other stuff, like I was a very intellectually curious person. I was just so unchallenged and bored. And so I was like, okay, yeah, I'll go to this school. I think that sounds great. And my brother had already made that choice and he was going to private school. I was like, all right, I think that's probably the right thing for me to do as well. A side effect of that, however, was that I don't know if this is still the rule, but at least at the time, there was a rule in place that if you lived out of state, you couldn't play high school athletics in Ohio at the time. And I think it was a rule and that was made mostly for like football recruitment and stuff like that, especially in like Southern Ohio. But the impact of that on me it turns out, was pretty devastating. Now, for the first time in my life, I was no longer playing any organized sports. I didn't have any coaches really in my life. I didn't have that consistent training. And again, like I grew up undiagnosed autistic, right? So I don't have any regularity in my life that way. Like I don't, I think for me too, that was probably something that was really good for me. And I did get involved in stuff. I did like student council and mock UN, and it was like on debate for a little bit, but it wasn't the same. Interestingly, w- while I was radicalizing into white supremacy in my sophomore year, I was actually the president of my sophomore class. But, like, even though people are like, "Oh, yeah, Shannon," like, I still didn't feel like I belonged. I was president of my student class, and I was like, I don't belong anywhere. Like, I don't belong with y'all," which, like, I felt was kinda why I got elected. At the same time, I discovered skateboarders and skateboarding and punk rock and the punk rock scene. And I started going to shows and hanging out with these people, and I would sneak out at night. I would go listen to, music that just was, felt so just transgressive, definitely stuff that my parents would hate, which wasn't my motivation, like not overtly or whatever, but it was just, like I was like, all right, all right. I used to have all these kids in my neighborhood when we lived in New Jersey. It was like I had all these kids in my neighborhood. And now I'm like, I'm not going over to people's houses to hang out. I'm hanging out in like abandoned warehouses and stuff, like it isn't like I'm going over to somebody's house to go hang out with their mom and have cookies or whatever. It's like I'm going to hear like punk rock music and go do some mayhem or whatever. That coupled with like not having any coaches or anything in my life, I essentially don't really have any stable adults and any like regular contact with stable adults in my life. At the very end of my freshman year, so I was 14, my birthday's in June, so it was, like, just a couple weeks before I turned 15. I did what so many teenagers do, and I just completely lied my ass off to my parents, about where I was going and what I was doing so that I could go to a party because this boy that I liked was gonna be there. I don't even know if he knew I existed at that point but, like, I was like, "Alright, I'm gonna go to this party." And when I got there, I started drinking right away.
Had you drank before at this point?
I had definitely and I'm a couple months shy of being 2 years clean and sober right now, so
Mm.
I have actually, like, been reflecting on this pretty recently too about how, it took my substance abuse, um, disorder a lot longer to kind of kick in than my brother's. My brother like has been struggling with substance abuse disorder since he was a teenager.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, I didn't really, but then I was like, however, the first time, I ever drank, like I had a taste of the first time I ever drank, I got drunk. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm drunk. It was always, I'm, face down, throwing up, that it was always to excess. Always. I think in context and in context of, the 80s and all that, it was like, it didn't feel to me at the time like it was like more than everyone else, or it wasn't like drinking during the day. I didn't even drink every weekend or whatever, but it's like if there was a party or I was like over at someone's house where their parents weren't or whatever, I would drink. But it was, again, like in retrospect, I'm like, oh, I was drinking and getting really messed up from the jump. So it was like I didn't drink all the time, but every time I drank way too much.
Mhm.
And this night would be no exception. To this day, I still can't drink orange juice and liquor. I mean, now I don't drink liquor at all, but like I really struggle drinking orange juice because that's what I was drinking this night. I was drinking vodka and orange juice. I know what I was wearing. I was 14 years old. I know what I was wearing, the clothes I was wearing, the underwear I was wearing. I know what I drank. I know what I ate. By the end of the night, I ended up being raped by two men.
Ah.
Um, I've written, uh, you know, a personal reflection about that night and the things that I remember about it. And, that it was, I remember, at one point, like my friend that was outside of this house with me, like where everyone was partying or whatever, then like wasn't there anymore. And, I mean, I don't know. I remember talking about how I wanted to be an English professor at that point when I grew up, and how I didn't want to have sex until I was married, and talking about the moon because it was a full it was a full moon, and just saying no, and then sort of coming to in the backseat of this car, like to my own moaning, right? And I remember the dude being like, "See, I told you it would feel good," right? And then just like, like I'm just kind of in and out of consciousness or whatever, and just like burying my face in the turning away and burying my face in the crack of the back seat, just with the shame of it all and the shame that it did feel good, right? Like that's a weird part of, a lot of people's stories too. It's just like, well, how does my brain even process that or whatever?
Yeah.
Like that my body is responding to this as though it's pleasurable, right? And I remember him calling his friend over and just be like, "Here, it's your turn,"
Oh my
and then
gosh.
kinda passing out. And then I remember, walking back to the house, and they kinda, like, threw me in the screen door, in the back of the house, to where the kitchen was, and everyone was like, "Oh, where you been? Here," and shoving a plate of, white paper plate of chicken nuggets into my hand, and, with a big swatch of ketchup, and it, like, had me sit down in this, like, mustard yellow chair and eat these chicken nuggets. Um,
Wow. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. I strongly suspect this doesn't diminish that or whatever. I mean, it was horrible. It was horrible, and it's been a very defining set of moments in my life, that is for sure. But I also very strongly suspect, and my brother has asked me too, if he thinks that this is that we endured sexual childhood abuse or assault as children. Neither of us have a firm memory. Neither of us have anything that we can be like, yes, that's what happened. That's who did it. But we both have a sense that something happened to us as children, a very strong sense. And for us to both independently have that to me is like it's almost as to me, I'm just kind of like, we wouldn't both feel this way. Like my brother and I have had a very tenuous relationship for much of our adulthood. I'm like, there's no way that he's gonna come and ask me this. Like, if this was not something that is probably something that we both experienced as small children. And so I think too that sexual assault as a 14-year-old, that it was just, to me, I think part of the devastation of that was that it was truths that my body already felt about itself.
Mm,
Like, then I already felt like, it was there for other people's pleasure, and that it was worthless, and that my body's not really mine. Things like that, like very deep-seated beliefs that were already there, that this sexual assault, I think, really just, and especially it happening when I'm 14, I'm about to be 15 years old. That's my first, like, known sexual encounter. It really, I think it really patterned my brain and my self-image and, outlook on the world and myself and my place in it in a really profound way, in a profound and unhealthy way.
yeah.
Um, when I woke up the next morning, like, my first thought was like, "Did that even happen?" And then my very next thought was about how there was no way in hell I could tell my parents. That I knew that they would be more angry that I had lied about where I was going and that I had been drinking than they would be that I had just been assaulted. As an adult, I've had at least a couple conversations now with my mom about that. Like, she still doesn't even believe me. She's like, "Well, why didn't you tell me? If that happened, why didn't," I'm like,
Oh, wow.
"Do you see what everything else that happened in my life? Like, are you kidding me right now? Do you know what comes next in the story of my life?" And the first time I had this conversation with her was like maybe 10 years ago or something, and she was just like, "Well, I mean, you were drinking, so you were kind of like asking for it or
Oh,
whatever." I'm
no,
just
not
like,
that.
and I
No.
and I was kind of like, I don't know. I like, how do you?
I just have to say, for the record, for everybody listening, that that is not asking for it, that making a choice for yourself does not equal consent for something else to happen to you. Those men made their decisions against your will. And I just want to make it perfectly clear that that's not giving permission to anyone to touch you in any way.
Yes. And part of my work and recovery and everything, it's like, yeah, okay, like I bear responsibility for for a lot of choices that I made that put me in dangerous situations, that put me in places where I was not valuing myself and things like that, like, but other people's actions are still always, that's their responsibility.
Mhm.
Lots of people get drunk and don't get raped.
Yeah.
That's not something that I did. But yeah, our most recent conversation after my dad died, was that my mom doesn't believe me. I'm just like, I don't know. I'm just like, I don't really have anything I need to say to you at this point, really. Like, if it's something so fundamental. But on the other hand, that her responses was that it was actually like a relief for me as an adult. That it was like, okay, the things that come next for me were not predicated on an illusion that 14-year-old Shannon had about her parents' response, right? Like, that my belief that my parents would be more angry at me than they would be sympathetic, because I'd been yelled at every time I was sick, every time I was hurt, like, it was always, and that was always the go-to response or whatever. It was like everything that comes next wasn't predicated on this illusion that I had about their response. And so having those conversations with my mom as an adult was actually like a relief, because it was like, okay,
You
like,
were right in your thought process.
14-year-old Shannon knew what was up. Like, and I don't know that I would have survived that. I mean, I barely survived as it is, and I still have days where it's a blanket fort day or whatever. Like, I still have days where I'm just like, I don't, well, we'll try to hang on there till tomorrow or whatever. Um, but I don't know that I would have survived that. That there was this part of me that, like, now I'm learning to do a much better job of tapping into, that was fiercely protective of me.
Yeah.
I was like, this is not, you cannot. But at the same time, I also didn't have any other adults in my life that I could trust at that point. I didn't have any friends' parents. The people who ran my school were nuns. Like, I sure was not going to go tell them, like,
Yeah.
that was not going to happen. I don't have any coaches anymore. I don't have anybody really in my life to be like, you are not okay. And at one point, my parents did send me to, it was like 3 weeks of like inpatient. They thought I was drinking and using drugs. I think like they thought I was using drugs, and I wasn't. I actually was not a drug user for nearly any of my life, especially not like during my adolescence. I did this like inpatient stint, and in retrospect, I'm just like, I self-harmed. I was a cutter. I had all of these like markers that something that I had been sexually assaulted. Um, and nobody ever asked. Like, I'm just like, y'all are supposed to be like psychologists and psychiatrists, and like I have all this stuff going on for me. And like, how did none of y'all just ask, like, okay, well, let's talk about your sexual history? And I mean, to be fair, if somebody straight up asked me if I had been sexually assaulted, I don't know that I would have been able to say yes at the time, because the way that I framed it for myself, and until my oldest son was born about 10 years later when I was 23 years old, the way I framed it was I lost my virginity to two men in a party when I was 14 years old.
Mm.
And it wasn't until, like, he was born and I was, like, dealing with some, like, birth trauma and stuff like that, that I was, like, "Oh, no, there's a word for when somebody angrily puts their body inside your body without your consent. That's what that." I didn't lose my virginity to two men at a party when I was 14 years old. I was raped in so many ways. Having a child and all that was so healing, but it was healing through,
Confrontation of your past.
well, and just my complete undoing.
Yeah.
That it was like, because the core values that I had for myself were like, my body is trash. My body is complete garbage. Like, I am worthless. I am valueless. My body is garbage. But I have this little boy who is love incarnate, that like, my body grew, my body birthed. Like, I was breastfeeding, and I'm like, my body continues to nourish this little boy, right? And so it's like the explosion and collision of these two like realities was just so much. How do these two things go together? These, like, because here is evidence of the miracles that my body can do.
Yeah.
And I am worthless. I'm a piece of garbage. I am, all this other stuff or whatever, and it was just kind of like, yeah. So early motherhood was fun.
Yeah. Wait. So
It's
we
devastating.
have gotten,
Yeah. We're so off track.
that's okay. We've gotten so much great context as to your mentality, your childhood, the things that led you into the movement. We haven't actually talked about the movement yet. So
No.
when did you get introduced, and what made you go, yes, that's the structure that I need in my life?
So I went back to trying to do all of my life stuff after that party. It was just about summertime. And the boy that I went to that party to go see because I liked him, like a few weeks later, he ended up being my boyfriend. And so that summer, I actually swam on the swim team, the like local pool swim team. So it wasn't high school sports. It was just club swimming. I actually did really good, but I spent a lot of time with this boy. I would sneak out of my house, and I started smoking. And I grew up, both my parents smoked. Like, I don't know. I was going to a lot of punk rock shows and doing all that stuff, and then as very predictably that my relationship with this boy just completely imploded. That his parents were going through a divorce. I had all my stuff going on. It was just, it was like we were so overly attached, and then it was, just and so there's like this little buffer of time after that sexual assault where I was kind of okay-ish. And then we broke up, and then it was like it was kinda like all bets were off for me, that I just became so filled with just self-hatred and self-loathing, and the main way that that was coming out was just rage. I was so angry, and I was hanging out, in the punk rock scene, and so it was just like, like, the angriest people on the periphery of that were these white power skinheads, and they just got in fights all the time with everyone. And they were just, that, and I was just like, I think the rage in me really resonated with the rage that they displayed, and I was just kind of like, there are people who are like, oh, well, if a baseball coach or whatever had come along, not me, not at that point. I needed somewhere where it was okay to be really fucking angry.
You needed a rage room.
Yeah, or, I don't know, something like jujitsu or something. I
Yeah.
don't know, something, some kinda like MMA or something, I don't know. That it was like, these people that, like, they all I had to do was show up in the body I was born into, and then all of my rage and anger and wanting to destroy stuff and hurt people, that was seen as an asset. Like, the more angry I was, the better that I was seen. Like, I didn't have to do anything. I needed a place where I could go, where I could just be the disaster that I was, and that it was seen as an asset, right? That it was like I was valuable. I wasn't too much there. My rage wasn't like, "Oh, you need to tamp that down a little," or whatever. It was like, and that felt awesome.
Yeah.
It was very seductive that it was like, "Okay, well, like, I might not have any power, but I can sure make you afraid of me. I can walk like, if I'm wearing, Nazi stuff or whatever, like, and I've got my head shaved and I got my boots on or whatever, it's like I can walk into a room and I can make you afraid instantly."
So you shaved your head too.
Yeah, I had like there's like a skinhead girl cut where it's like you still have like bangs and stuff and yeah, there. But again, like that's again, it was some of it was just about the transgressive nature of it too, where it's just like, now there's like memes and stuff, right? And so like some of how meme culture works is like it's to you post something to be offensive, like for the purpose of being offensive, for it to be over the top, for it to be offensive, right? And then people will be like, you can judge their response to it or whatever, and you can backpedal. You can be like, oh yeah, well that's just I'm just being ironic or whatever. Like I don't really think that or whatever. But it's like you just sort of like shock and awe, and then it's like, oh my gosh, like that's really over the top. But that was like I was like a physical meme. That it was like I could walk into a room and people would be offended and or afraid just by my very physical presence. And so for a young woman who felt totally powerless, I didn't even have control over my own body. Like that felt a lot like power.
Yeah.
I'd learned from a very young age, if I can just take the pain, I can do whatever I want, right? Like all I got to do is take the pain.
Yeah.
So I'd fight anyone. I'd fight dudes. Like I didn't care. I'd be like, well, if the worst that's going to happen is I get my ass kicked. Like, whatever. But people be like, oh my gosh, you see this tiny little chick? Like, go after that dude's like 6 foot tall or whatever. Like, and it was just like, yeah, all right. I didn't have, like, I felt like I didn't have anything. Nobody cared about all the great things about me. Nobody cared about any of those things.
You were being rewarded for your violence. And so the rage and the anger.
And accepted for the first time.
Yeah. And feeling that power, all of that makes sense. And what I want to ask though is, did you then make the other stuff fit into your new ideology? Did you make yourself believe that you hated other races, or were you just there for the power trip, the control?
The way that for me that it began was, just spending more and more time with these people because it's like, okay, I can just be this very like angry creature that I am right now. I don't have to do anything. For the first time in my life, I don't have to worry about being good enough, right? And then I started listening to like some of the music that they listen to. And singing along with that music, right? And that's kind of it's a sort of soft introduction to things that, it's like the ideas, the conspiracy theories, the lingo and language. It's like, again, like in sort of like meme culture, it's like, oh yeah, well I can backpedal on that, right? Like, oh well, I'm not actually saying N-word, I'm just singing along with this song. Right? I'm not actually like using like anti-Semitic slurs. I'm just singing along with this song or whatever. And so it's sort of that sort of soft pedal. And then the way that, the way that high demand groups work and, like, and why in today's day and age with so much of this happening online, why I think it's so exponentially more dangerous or whatever, is that I began to build this an echo chamber, right? And it's like for me, this had to happen in a physical space, right? So it's like I had to actually become more physically isolated and everything. Where it was just like I was spending more and more time only with people who held, these racist and anti-Semitic views, where it was, becoming more and more normalized in my world. It didn't exist then, but it's like, you watch an episode of The Office or whatever, and somebody be making like racist or anti-Semitic jokes like the whole time. And that was very normal, right? Like, whereas if somebody did that and that was not like people were like, what? That is so off the chain. Like, that's so not okay. But it was like my world got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller so that it was like I was only around other people pretty much that also believed that. And so it was, it was not a huge leap after, not a very long amount of time to just be like, okay, well, this is just, I give my assent to this, right? That it's just like, and I've wondered what happened to my empathy because I'm a very highly empathetic person. I was as a child, I am now. And I'm just like, did I have like a sociopic break or, like what happened? And my working hypothesis at this point is that my empathy became completely inward focused. That I I was struggling so much in ways that I didn't know that I was struggling, right? That it was like all of it just became my empathy totally became inward focused. And I became because I was so disconnected from the things that I was saying and doing as being actually and genuinely hurtful and harmful to other human beings. Right, then I was like, "Well, it's just words, it's ideas and whatever." Even, like and even, like, even doing, some of the things that we were doing and stuff, like, graffiti and flyering, and stuff like that, it didn't connect in my brain. That I had grown up and I had, like, Black friends when I was growing up, I had Jewish friends when I was growing up, and it's like, it didn't, like, connect in my brain, like, this is, like, hurtful and harmful to them. Like, it was just I just had no concept of that whatsoever. And the people who I've helped leave, that I've mentored as they've left this stuff, to that very often when they're in the very early stages of leaving, almost all of them will be like, "Oh, well, I didn't believe in violence." Like I didn't condone violence. I didn't endorse violence. Like I just had these ideas or whatever. And it's just like, okay, we're going to need to take a time out because this is inherently violent. This was like part of what started me like trying to be like, okay, well, what happens And what happens that we're able to just separate the reality of how inherently violent. My whole worldview was basically, that other other people did not have full humanity or whatever, or didn't deserve the same things that I deserved, or whatever, just by nature of my whiteness or whatever. And okay, well then how do we go about structuring a world around that or whatever? Everything is it's all based on the dehumanization of other human beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's still sort of mystifying to me in a lot of ways, the way that we can allow our brains to do that. I mean, and in very widespread ways, right? We still are living with systemic white supremacy. We are still living with systemic oppressions of many kinds, right? And so it's our human brains are quite capable of dehumanizing other human beings when we feel afraid or under threat, or we need to seek a sense of control or power.
What was it like as a woman in this space? Were you outnumbered quite a bit? Were you treated differently?
I've actually, so if you Google it, I don't know. I co-authored a case study about female experience, and I think it's entitled something like Adjacency to Power or something like that. So one of the things that it was outside of this ecosystem, I was I don't know. I wasn't super popular. I mean, I was I don't know. I was kind of I didn't feel super successful dating or whatever. I don't know. I just never, those not, I wasn't one of the hot chicks or whatever. But inside this ecosystem, because there were so few women who were really dedicated, that it was I had this sort of elevated status as sort of big fish, small pond kind of thing,
Mm.
right? Where it's just okay, there just aren't there were women around, and there were young women around, that there were girlfriends and stuff like that, but most of them were not as dedicated as I was all in. Part of this too, in retrospect, this is not something that is this is just as a matter of fact. It's not an explanation or whatever. I'm an all-in kind of person. I'm autistic and ADHD, right? So it's for me, I'm an all-in person. Now I know I have to okay, I gotta do better, making better choices about when I go all in or not. The net result of that was mostly that I would end up dating whoever was sort of the leader of wherever I was. Right. And so it was kind of again, I felt completely powerless, that I was finding this fractured sense of power and empowerment through violence and making people feel afraid or being intimidating, and also through attaching myself to people who had power within this ecosystem.
Yeah.
I was still treated like shit, as a woman. I mean, I know it's going to shock you that in a belief system that people as less than human who are perceived as weaker, that women were also treated poorly. I know that's a total shocker. Um, but that was the part that people didn't really talk about. And this is there's still a big resurgence of trad wife stuff happening right now.
Yeah.
And to me, the parts that people are leaving out, that they leave off of their TikTok and they leave off of their Instagram, is that when that camera's closed, that their partner is almost definitely treating them like garbage. That they are treating them as less than human, that they are treating them like objects, that, that they are treating them like they are just there for their pleasure when they want it, and that they don't have to do the part of the part that's supposed to be the other part of trad wifing, is that they don't have to do the guy doesn't have to do their part of loving the totality of that woman, right? To submit to her too, right? The way that it's that's kind of the other, that's kind of the other part of that, but we skip over that part, right? Because That's not
Aesthetic.
that's not what suits the agenda, right? Yeah, that's not the aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
That it's just like, that the women are sort of this like front face. We are, because we're women. And so it's this sort of like gentler, kinder face of white supremacy.
So you said you were getting close to the leaders, and I'm curious if you were ever in the same circles, the same groups as Arno Michaelis.
I had never met Arno while I was involved.
Okay.
I did a Christian Picciolini, and I actually did meet, like, I was dating his best friend. I actually lived with
Oh,
Christian for a little bit. Like, I didn't have anywhere to stay. I actually, like, lived with him a little bit. He and I, like, never dated or anything like that, but, like, we were good friends. Um, in his book, there's a chapter where it's like, "Yeah, we were going to Georgia to go see the." I'm like, "That's me. I was the girl in
oh.
Georgia."
Nice.
I was the girl in Georgia. That was me. So I was like, I was in that world with him. Arno and I we didn't know each other then. He and I have like, we've met subsequently, like in the last 10 years or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, we had never met, but I did meet Christian, and, Christian and I eventually got reconnected through sort of crazy circumstances on Facebook. And he's like, "Oh, we have all these people, and we're like doing some of this work and stuff to help people leave." And I was like, "Oh, I've been doing that too, just kind of like on my own." And it was like, "Oh, well, let's go." I was like, "All right, cool. Let's do work together. That sounds great."
Yeah, let's talk about your exit out of the whole movement. I know it had a lot to do with the compassion of a particular woman who took you in.
I ended up, I was like 15 and a half as I was like really, as that was kind of like my full on entrance into this stuff. And I would end up moving all over the country. When I was 16, my parents moved to Augusta, Georgia, and, I was still a minor, so I had to go with them. But very soon after we got there, I left. And I would just come and go until I was picked up by the police for being a runaway, or, whatever situation I was in, whoever I was dating or whatever, like that it would get so violent, like personally violent, that I would have to leave. Where I
Yeah.
was just like, I'm gonna die. If I don't get out of here, I'm gonna die. Like they're gonna kill me. And then I'd beg my parents. My parents were very like, "Okay, well, the law says we have to take you back, so we'll take you back." Eventually, I was no longer a minor, so this was, going on for several years. And they were like, I had left home again, and they were just like, "You can't, I don't know where you're gonna go, but you can't stay here anymore."
Our conversation ended up being over 2 hours, almost 2.5 hours. So we obviously wanted to separate it into two parts so people didn't become overwhelmed. And we want to make sure to give you guys some bite-sized chunks of content. So in the second episode, we really dived into what it was like deconstructing that mindset through the compassion and sympathy of other people, through that cognitive dissonance, through education, learning, and growth, and also through becoming a mother. She ended up going on to have 7 children, and she talks about the ways in which the old programmed mindset kind of seeped into her motherhood, but how she was actively trying and is trying to fight against that with new parenting ways and a new sense of self. So thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe. Becoming an advocate really is the best way to support the channel, as well as leaving those words of encouragement. If you want to support further, you can become a patron at patreon.com/cults2consciousness. You can find merch at cults2consciousness.com. You can come to Mexico with us at the end of October. We do have a few spots left at that discounted rate. All of those links are in the description, as well as where to find Shannon. She's given us links to her Patreon, her social media, and all the ways that you can find her. So thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, I'll link 2 more down here below. Definitely subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss part 2 when it drops. And we have other incredible interviews coming out from the neo-Nazi world, from the white supremacist world, even the KKK. Thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.